Good morning. Welcome to another virtual sermon at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. What I'm trying to do during this time of the social lockdown is to find verses that might be helpful so that we can learn something as we go through this time. But that is always a little frightening to me because I don't know what you're going through personally. And when the timing is wrong, something that's intended as helpful can come across in a very different way. So if the wounds are too fresh, you might want to save this sermon for a later day. Because I want to talk about a principle of how to use our suffering and how to use our pain. And that's something that happens when we're coming out of it. And that's a natural thing. You can't force it to happen. But after we've suffered long enough, we want meaning and we want beauty and we want some gift to give the world from that. But that has to happen naturally. We have to heal into that kind of wisdom. So I'm offering this hopefully at the right time. If it's not, again, please feel free to fast forward or do whatever you need to do. I'm not saying anywhere in this sermon that the coronavirus has been sent to us to teach us a lesson. I don't believe that. I don't believe that God sends disease to teach lessons. I don't think the universe works like that. I think it's more an evolutionary process, a cosmic process. I don't think that there's a being somewhere that sends us a virus to teach us how to use Amazon Prime or something like that, or some more spiritual wisdom. But I do believe, and from my own life experience, that a helpful attitude is that the days that do not make us happy may make us wise. That even days that are not what we would ever choose, and they can be devastating at that time, that when we look back on those days, we discover they're a part of the wisdom that we develop later, they're part of the beauty that we discover later, that they're not in vain. These horrible times of pain and suffering are not in vain. The passage we're looking at today is in Romans. And again, I hesitate to read the words because it may be too early for some people in their suffering. But this is a time written in persecution, people dying, people being bullied. And this was the wisdom of a community. Coming through the words of Paul. Paul says in Romans, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts. Now that might not be how you would word that. You may not believe in God, but I think the wisdom that's here is fits in other packages too. So again, the hopeful message is that days that do not make us happy may still make us wise. The passage starts off with a very problematic verse. It says, we rejoice in our sufferings. And I'm going to save that till later because I think that's sort of the punchline, and we can get to that too early. What I want to ask about is, what is that gift that some people have, some artists have, to turn their suffering into beauty? When you look at the lives of Van Gogh, Ray Charles, some of the most beautiful art that's ever been produced has come through tremendous suffering in people's lives. And that isn't an excuse to seek out suffering, of course. But since we suffer anyway, what is that art? What is the art that transforms suffering into beauty, that translates confusion into wisdom? People like Einstein enter into incredibly complicated and maddeningly ambiguous conditions and find wisdom there. It's almost like if we want to learn courage, we have to pass through fear. If we want to learn wisdom, we have to pass through confusion. If we want to learn hope, we have to pass through disappointment. So I think that's what Paul is saying when he says that suffering produces endurance. I don't think he's saying every time you step on a nail, you're supposed to say, well, this is a good stroke of luck. I'll learn a whole lot from this pain. I don't think he's saying that at all. But he is saying, I think, that because life is transformation, this is what I'm hearing anyway, because life is transformation, we shouldn't take pain or pleasure as permanent states. They're passages that we go through. A lot of the symbols of the church, I believe, are misunderstood. But if you look at the cultures and religions of the day, something like hell was not originally an idea of a punishment for sin. Hell was more that those times in life, those passageways in life where it's torturous to change. And we still have to go through them. That in life, when we lose someone who's our very breath, when we lose a job that gave us our sense of self-worth, that if we try to hold on to the past, it's torture. And that's the symbol of hell, is when we think transformation is permanent, when we think the depression we're feeling today will always be there, when we think the shame of failure or betrayal. Any state is ephemeral, is passing, but it doesn't feel like that when we're in pain. So I think what Paul is saying is, remember the life process. You don't have to feel it, and you don't have to believe it on a given day, but don't forget it. Hold on to the idea that life is all transformation. There's a quote from Gene Houston, who is a student of world religions and a teacher. Who said, the wounding becomes sacred when we are willing to release our old stories and to become the vehicles through which the new story may emerge into time. Let me read that again. The wounding becomes sacred when we are willing to release our old stories and become the vehicles through which the new story may emerge into time. One of the most important parts of the symbol of hell is that it isn't eternal. That it's a passage through which we come, which deconstructs us. We all want to transform, but we don't realize that that word means a change in our form. That's what we don't want. And if we can realize that wound is opening us up to something new. That in the symbol, a dragon or a demon had a gift somewhere to give. That you would go down into hell and be deconstructed, but you would come up with the prize. You'd come up with wisdom, or you'd come up with creativity and insight. Something that only suffering could teach, which didn't justify the suffering. The suffering didn't happen to teach a lesson. But since you were suffering anyway, that was a helpful thing. So Paul says that suffering produces endurance, and then endurance produces character. Character is when we make the virtues, wisdom, temperance, justice, courage. Did I say courage? Courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice are the four great virtues. That when that becomes who we are, when that becomes our internal property, it changes our lives. My dad really wanted to be an artist, and he had too many kids to do it. But he had a picture from Norman Rockwell. When he was thinking about becoming an artist as a kid, he sent a letter to Norman Rockwell asking him what art school to go to. And Norman Rockwell didn't have a recommendation, but it took him a while to write the letter back. And the reason why was because his studio had burned down. And he sent my dad copies of some sketches he had done of the studio burning down, of the firefighters that were there. He was sketching all of that. So his art was something that got him through what would be hell for anybody else. The burning of all of his studio, the works that he had done. Instead of holding on to the past, he kept his heart. And that transformed that. I believe that's what Paul is talking about. He's not talking about anything magical. He's saying that that process fills our heart with love. He literally says that. That this character becomes hope, an orientation for the future. And the reason hope doesn't disappoint us, because the whole point is to have our hearts in tune. When we're there, then whatever happens in life gets transformed into beauty, goodness, and so forth. Assuming that we're not crushed by it, of course. This is not simplistic teaching. But to realize some of the great treasures of antiquity came from horrific times. The mosaics that we see that are so beautiful are broken pottery, right? The quilts that we see are often torn or abandoned cloths and blankets and things. The irony of life is that happiness doesn't come from pleasure. It comes from something deeper than that. It comes from the virtues themselves. So if we want a flower to smell good, the irony is we can't just spray Lysol on the blossoms. Sometimes we even have to put manure on the roots. That it is counterintuitive. What leads to happiness may not feel happy at the time. What leads to wisdom may feel more like confusion at the time. What leads to courage may feel more like terror and cowardice at the time. But those are the passages that we sometimes need to pass through. So our passage today, when it says that we rejoice in our suffering, we certainly don't want to be simplistic about that at all. But we do want to remember that that wounding can become sacred when we recognize it as a part of the life process. We're not seeking out pain, but Paul is almost talking about like a bingo card, where we realize that disappointment, betrayal, failure, all of those things are like a bingo card where you can just check it off. Okay, I've covered the fear, I've confusion, all of those things, check. I can check them all off. And I can trust through the life process that if I can transform them into love and into compassion, they will become gifts. I can trust that even when days do not make me happy, they can make me wise. And I think what Paul is saying is if we're going through hell anyway, why not come back with the prize? So I invite you now to your own reflection on these words. Stay safe. Go in peace.